On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front of the Red Army crossed the fences of a camp in occupied Upper Silesia. What they found inside defied any human capacity for understanding. More than 7,000 prisoners in extreme conditions of starvation, hundreds of corpses, and 48 entire barracks filled with clothing, suitcases, children's shoes, prosthetic limbs and glasses. 7 tons of human hair in bags waiting to be transported to Germany. Auschwitz was not a camp, it was a system, a complex of more than 40 facilities that operated between May 1940 and January 1945, where at least 1.1 million people lost their lives. The most widely accepted figure, calculated by the Polish historian Franciszek Piper and published by Yad Vashem in 1991, states that 960,000 of those victims were Jews. The other 140,000 included ethnic Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and other European nationalities. But the story of Auschwitz does not end in 1945. 8 decades later, archaeologists, forensic historians, and forensic scientists continue to excavate the ground of Birkenau. Time capsules buried by terror continue to emerge. Questions continue to surface that the documents destroyed by the SS in January 1945 cannot answer. What follows are 20 of those mysteries, 20 open wounds in history, 20 reasons why Auschwitz remains the most studied, most debated, and most disturbing place of the 20th century. Mystery 1. The Lost Diaries of Mengele. Josef Rudolf Mengele was born on March 16, 1911 in Günzburg, Bavaria, into a family of industrialists. He studied medicine and philosophy in Munich and Frankfurt. He defended his first doctoral thesis in 1935 under the title Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw in 4 Racial Groups. 2 years later, he obtained his second doctorate in medical sciences with a study on cleft lips and cleft palates. He was meticulous, he was orderly, he kept records of everything. When he arrived at Auschwitz on May 30, 1943, Mengele was 32 years old and had a scientific ambition consumed by an ideology that turned human beings into research material. He was first assigned as physician of the Roma family camp in Sector B11E of Birkenau and later promoted to chief physician of Auschwitz II in November 1943. From that position, he supervised countless selections on the ramp, personally sending hundreds of thousands of people toward the gas chambers while reserving twins, dwarfs, and people with physical anomalies for his experiments. Mengele's presence on the ramp became almost ceremonial. According to several survivor testimonies, he appeared immaculately uniformed, wearing white gloves, and shouted through the platform loudspeakers, "Zwillinge heraus! Twins, step forward!" He separated them from the rest of the new arrivals before the selection began. Those children would be housed in barracks 29 and 31 of Birkenau, where Mengele had even established a kindergarten as a facade to disguise his human laboratory. His experiments with twins are the most documented: exhaustive measurements of body parts, photographs, cross-analysis of blood between siblings, surgeries without anesthesia, blood transfusions between twins of different blood types. When one twin died, Mengele ordered the surviving twin to be executed so both bodies could be dissected simultaneously. Survivor Eva Moses Kor, who suffered his experiments as a child, stated decades later that Mengele injected them with unknown substances after which they developed fevers that nearly killed them. She never knew what those substances were. The real mystery begins in the first days of January 1945. Historian Dr. James Bulgian and other researchers have documented that Mengele left Auschwitz by car on the day of evacuation, at the end of January 1945, carrying a significant amount of research material, data records on twins, on dwarfs, anthropometric measurements, and genetic analysis results. According to the testimony of prisoner Dr. Marina Puzina, who worked with Mengele, he deliberately took those records with him. Survivors Wilhelm Brasse and several members of the Sonderkommando later confirmed after the war that they had been ordered to burn photographs and films of the experiments, but not everything was destroyed. Mengele's experiments ended in the first days of December 1944, just 2 weeks before the evacuation of the camp. With the Red Army approaching, the destruction of the camp administration began in order to erase the evidence. Wilhelm Brasser, who survived Auschwitz, testified after the war that he and a fellow prisoner received orders from Mengele to burn photographs and films of his experiments. However, not all the research material was destroyed. Prisoner Dr. Marina Puzina stated that Mengele left the camp on the day of evacuation carrying as many research data records as he could, especially those on twins and dwarfs. Where did those records go? Mengele fled through several camps until eventually reaching Argentina in 1949, using the false name Helmut Gregor. He lived under his real name in Buenos Aires for almost a decade, comfortably settled in one of the best neighborhoods of the capital, according to documents from the Argentine Federal Police recently uncovered by researchers from MDR Investigative. In 1959, after the capture of Adolf Eichmann by the Israeli Mossad, he fled to Paraguay, obtaining citizenship under the government of Alfredo Stroessner, and finally settled in Brazil, where he drowned in Bertioga on February 7, 1979, during a stroke while swimming in the sea. In 1985, Brazilian police discovered in his house in the neighborhood of Diadema in Sao Paulo more than 3,000 pages of writings that are now preserved at the headquarters of the Brazilian Federal Police. These are not his Auschwitz records. They are autobiographical memoirs, poems, philosophical reflections, an exercise in self-absolution written by a man who knew exactly what he had done. In that autobiographical text, Mengele tries to put himself in the place of his victims to demonstrate that he is stronger than them. According to analyses by researchers who have studied those pages, Mengele constructs a persona that he believes is himself, capable of suppressing his impulses, pretending indifference toward everyone. In February 2010, a grandson of a Holocaust survivor purchased at auction, for an undisclosed sum, Mengele's 180-page diary. In 2011, the same auction house again sold, also amid various protests, another 31 volumes of Mengele's diaries, acquired by an anonymous collector who paid $245,000. But the scientific records from Auschwitz, those notebooks filled with genetic data on twins and dwarfs, have still not appeared. They are not in any known archive. They are not in the German Federal Archives. They are not in Yad Vashem or in the archives of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. The specific results of his genetic studies, those that he himself considered his contribution to Nazi racial science, remain missing. The question historians cannot answer is whether those records were destroyed during his escape, whether they were at some point sold through the circuit of private collectors, or whether they are still resting in some uncatalogued archive, waiting to be discovered. Mystery 2. The sterilization experiments and the unknown substances. In Barrack No. 10 of Auschwitz I, the brick walls preserve a medical secret of dimensions that post-war trials could only partially outline. That building, adjacent to Block 11, was designated for medical experiments on women. The window on its ground floor faced the courtyard of the Wall of Death. From inside, the women could hear the shots to the back of the head of the condemned. SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Karl Klauberg, born in Wupperhof on September 18, 1898, was before the war a recognized authority in the treatment of female infertility. His reputation reached the SS circles in the most absurd way. He had successfully treated the wife of an SS officer who had been trying to conceive for years. The news spread quickly within those circles, and in July 1942, Himmler summoned him to Berlin. Also present at that meeting were Richard Glucks, supervisor of the concentration camp system, and Professor Karl Gebhardt. Klauberg was placed at the disposal of the Reich for a mission opposite to the one that had earned him fame, instead of curing infertility, to produce it on a massive scale. He arrived at Auschwitz at the end of 1942. Commander Rudolf Höss placed Block 10 at his disposal. On the second floor of the building, 2 rooms were installed where, between 1943 and January 1945, between 196 and 413 women were held at all times, mostly Jewish women from countries occupied by Germany. Klauberg developed a method of non-surgical mass sterilization. Under the pretext of performing a gynecological examination, he first verified that the fallopian tubes were open, and then introduced a specially prepared chemical irritant that caused acute inflammation. This caused the tubes to fuse within a few weeks, becoming blocked. X-rays were used to verify the results of each procedure. These procedures were carried out in a brutal manner. Complications were frequent, including peritonitis and hemorrhages of the reproductive tract, leading to high fever and sepsis. The method Klauberg tested required injecting a specially prepared chemical irritant called iodopin into the women's reproductive organs, causing inflammation. After several weeks, another preparation known as noerontium was injected again, this time containing a 5 to 10% formalin solution, into the reproductive organs. A subsequent X-ray confirmed the occlusion of the fallopian tubes. All of this was carried out during so-called routine gynecological examinations. The chemist who prepared the solution was Johannes Goebel, representative of Schering-Werke. Here lies the central mystery. The exact formulation of the compound that Klauberg called his irritant was not fully documented in any surviving archive. What is known is that it contained iodopin in the first phase and a formalin solution in the second, but the exact percentages, the volumes administered per procedure, the intervals between the phases of the protocol, and the criteria for selecting the patients who were subjected to an additional third injection remain without complete documentation. The medical records that Klauberg kept of his experiments were either destroyed or taken with him during the evacuation of the camp. In June 1943, Klauberg presented a report on his findings. He wrote that they still required many improvements and adjustments, but that even at that stage he could state that, with the help of his medical staff, he was capable of sterilizing 1,000 women per day. Auschwitz-Birkenau. That letter to Himmler, dated June 7, 1943, was presented as evidence in the doctor's trial at Nuremberg and is one of the few original documents that survived. However, even that letter describes the method in vague terms, as if Klauberg himself deliberately withheld the technical details of the formulation. The other doctor operating in Block 10 was SS Hauptsturmführer Horst Schumann, born in Halle on May 1, 1906, former director of the euthanasia centers at Grafeneck and Sonnenstein. Using 2 Röntgen chambers, he focused X-rays on the testicles of men and the ovaries of women in an attempt to determine the optimal radiation dose needed to cause total infertility. The consequences of this irradiation included severe burns, radiation dermatitis, and purulent lesions that were difficult to heal. After several weeks, some of the male and female prisoners were surgically castrated for the purpose of subjecting their organs to laboratory testing. The exact technical parameters of the radiation doses that Schumann used are also not precisely documented. The 2 Röntgen chambers he used were Siemens-manufactured devices. The level of radiation these machines could generate in 1942 and the specific dose per session that Schumann considered effective to produce sterilization without immediately killing the patient were never recorded in accessible documents. Like Klauberg, Schumann evacuated the camp before the arrival of the Red Army. What distinguishes both doctors in terms of their legacy of impunity is significant. During the evacuation of the camp, Klauberg went to Ravensbrück, where he continued the experiments. After the war, he was captured by Soviet authorities and tried. He was sentenced to prison, but in 1955, based on an agreement between the Federal Republic of Germany and the Soviet Union, he returned to Germany and decided to resume his medical practice. However, he was arrested on November 21st of that same year, Auschwitz-Birkenau. He died on August 9, 1957, in the Kiel prison awaiting trial without having answered before a German court for his crimes in Auschwitz. Schumann lived freely in Ghana for years, working as a doctor in the hospital in Kumasi. When Ghana accepted a German extradition request in 1966, and he was returned to the Federal Republic of Germany, his trial was repeatedly suspended for health reasons. He died in Frankfurt in 1983 at the age of 77, without having been convicted. The exact records of what was experienced under his hands remain buried with him. The testimony of survivor Meti Hartmann, a Dutch Jewish woman born in Amsterdam in 1902, preserved in the Auschwitz Museum archives, describes the experience with chilling precision. Professor Klauberg arrived at the camp and they made her lie naked on a black table covered with a white glass panel with a light. The operating room lights were turned off. Then a device was inserted into her vagina. She felt pain like giving birth. A red lamp was turned on. Then they took a photograph. Auschwitz. Neither Klauberg nor Schumann ever described the specific purpose of that photographic documentation. The photographs taken during the procedures disappeared. Mystery 3. The studies of racial superiority and the collection of skeletons. There is a category of experiments in Auschwitz that is especially disturbing because it required first selecting the victims based on their physical characteristics, then killing them, and finally preserving their remains as study material. The project was simple in its horror: to build a collection of Jewish skeletons in order to scientifically demonstrate the racial inferiority of the Jewish population. The instigator was SS Obersturmbannführer Dr. August Hirt, professor of anatomy at the Reichsuniversität Straßburg in the Alsace-Lorraine region incorporated into the Reich. Hirt convinced Heinrich Himmler that it was necessary to build a systematic anthropological collection of Jewish skeletons for future generations of Nazi racial researchers. Himmler gave his approval. In 1943, the selection began in Auschwitz. A group of 115 prisoners, 79 men and 36 women, were chosen for their physical characteristics considered stereotypically Jewish. Skull measurements, facial proportions, jaw dimensions, nose shape, eye and hair color. They were photographed, measured while alive, and then, in August 1943, transported to the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp in Alsace, where they were killed with gas and sent to the university. Rudolf Brandt and Wolfram Sievers, general director of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi research institute that supervised the project, were tried and executed in 1948 after the doctors' trial at Nuremberg. What the tribunal could not fully establish was which specific methods of racial classification the doctors used to select their victims, what tables and anthropometric parameters they applied during that selection in Auschwitz, and how many similar experiments were carried out without leaving known records. The final whereabouts of all anthropometric research documents generated by the project are also not completely clear. Part of the material was discovered by Allied forces upon the liberation of Natzweiler-Struthof. But the full methodology of the selection process in Auschwitz, the internal protocol used by doctors to classify prisoners according to racial features on the ramp or in the blocks, remains not fully documented. Mystery 4. The unknown genetic results of twin experiments. The question historians cannot answer with certainty is not what Mengele did, but what he believed he had discovered. The distinction matters because between those two questions lies an abyss of destroyed evidence, fraudulent science, and criminal academic ambition. Mengele did not arrive at Auschwitz as a purposeless killer. He arrived with a defined research project, institutionally supported by one of the most prestigious scientific centers of the Reich. The twin experiments were not studies on how to make German women have more children, as many survivors believed. In reality, they were a continuation of Verschuer's research, involving genetic studies, studies on heredity, certain anomalies in organism structure, and specific proteins that could be used to identify susceptibility to diseases. Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics since 1942, had built his academic career on the comparative study of twins. He had a fundamental methodological problem. Twin studies are long-term projects requiring decades of follow-up and the consent of subjects. Auschwitz solved both problems at once. In a concentration camp, there was access in one place to a multitude of people of different races, different origins and appearances, often suffering from various diseases. And most importantly, twins were also there, constantly available. According to historian Paul Weindling, records show that 582 twins were gathered by Mengele for research purposes. Mengele's interest in twins has been the subject of speculation, with some suggesting he was attempting to increase the German birth rate. However, Marwell argues that his interest was rooted in the established tradition of twin studies used to assess the heritability of traits. Wikipedia. The numbers from other researchers differ. Some studies cite up to 3,000 children subjected to his experiments. The discrepancy reflects the imprecision of surviving records. The working protocol was systematic. Mengele used prisoners with medical or scientific training as assistants, including physician Miklos Niesli and anthropologist Dina Gottlieb. Mengele was known for experimenting with eyes. One of his studies was related to heterochromia iridum, a condition in which a person's eyes are different colors. After killing people with heterochromia, Mengele extracted their eyes and sent them to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity and Genetics in Berlin under the direction of Dr. Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer. Those regular shipments of biological material to Berlin are the central knot of the mystery. Von Verschuer received blood, organs, eyes and statistical data from Auschwitz between 1943 and 1945. He used that material for his scientific publications during the war, attributing the work to his ongoing research without mentioning the source. When he was investigated after the war, he claimed he did not know the material came from criminal experiments. The 1946 denazification investigation concluded that it was not possible to prove conscious complicity, and von Verschuer resumed his academic career, eventually becoming a professor in Münster until 1965. Mengele wanted to continue the twin experiments he had begun with von Verschuer, and now he had a captive population on which to do so. Although his previous research had been legitimate, his work at Auschwitz-Birkenau was not. Abandoning medical ethics and research protocols, Mengele began carrying out horrific experiments on up to 1,500 pairs of twins, many of them children. The procedures included comparative analysis of blood markers between identical twins in order to identify variations that could be attributed to environment rather than genetics. According to Niesli's testimony in his memoirs published in 1946, Mengele regularly sent written reports to von Verschuer detailing his observations. Mengele personally intervened to stop an order by rival SS Dr. Heinz Thilo, who had selected half of the twins to be killed in October 1944. That detail reveals that Mengele protected his research subjects as a scientist would protect laboratory material, underscoring the level of organization of the project. What remains deeply enigmatic is the fate of the scientific notebooks that Mengele used in the camp. These are not the personal diaries that appeared at auction, they are the working notebooks where he recorded measurements, blood test results, and post-mortem observations. According to the testimony of prisoner Dr. Marina Puzina, those materials were taken out of the camp when Mengele evacuated. Mengele's work and that of his collaborators has generated data considered by medical experts to be completely devoid of scientific validity. Springer. But that is a retrospective judgment on the quality of the data, not evidence that the data do not exist. Somewhere those Auschwitz notebooks may still exist, containing the observations Mengele considered his contribution to human knowledge. That they are scientifically useless does not mean they have disappeared. Mystery 5. The Human Resistance Experiments and Lost Knowledge. Auschwitz did not operate in institutional isolation. It was part of a Nazi medical experimentation ecosystem that included Dachau, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, and Neuengamme. Each camp had its specialties. In Dachau, SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Sigmund Rasche, with the direct backing of Himmler, systematized hypothermia experiments for the Luftwaffe. In Auschwitz, categories of physical resistance overlapped with the interests of multiple military and industrial actors. The hypothermia experiments in Dachau are the best documented because Rasche produced detailed reports for Himmler. In an attempt to conceal the atrocities, the original incriminating records of most human experiments in the concentration camps were destroyed before the camps were captured by Allied forces. However, a large amount of information was later recovered related to the extensive communications between the researchers and Himmler. Immediately after the war, Leo Alexander investigated the Dachau hypothermia experiments and prepared a 228-page report that included 68 pages of personal commentary and the reproduction of a complete 56-page report to Himmler on the Dachau experiments, signed by doctors Holzlerner, Rasche, and Finke, dated October 21, 1942. That Dachau report is the exception, not the rule. For most experiments in the Nazi camp network, no equivalent document exists. In Auschwitz specifically, physical resistance experiments were distributed among several doctors under the general supervision of SS Standartenführer Dr. Edward Wirths, chief medical officer of the camp. Wirths did not leave systematic records of other doctors' experiments. He committed suicide in September 1945 while in British custody. In Dachau, hypothermia experiments involved between 300 and 400 subjects in 360 to 400 experiments. Another study placed prisoners naked outdoors for several hours in temperatures as low as -6 degrees Celsius. In addition to studying the physical effects of exposure to cold, the experimenters also evaluated different methods of rewarming survivors. A later witness testified that some subjects were thrown into boiling water to rewarm them. The exact parallel of those experiments in Auschwitz is more difficult to document. Survivor testimonies from Block 10 and other barracks describe procedures that go beyond sterilization, experiments to study resistance to starvation, to infectious diseases, and to extreme temperatures. Physician Emil Kaschub, a Wehrmacht officer assigned to Auschwitz in 1944, conducted experiments with toxic substances to study symptoms of simulated illness among German soldiers. Kaschub injected or rubbed all kinds of toxic substances onto prisoners' skin and also gave them oral medications to induce the same symptoms reported by German soldiers. His victims were dozens of Jews in whom he induced inflammations, purulent lesions, and difficult-to-heal ulcers that led to tissue necrosis. What makes this category of experimentation especially dark is the absence of a central organizer who kept systematic records. Rascher's hypothermia experiments are known because Rascher needed to document his results to justify Himmler's support and present them at military conferences. Rascher, in transmitting his findings on hypothermia to his superior Himmler, reported that death occurred between 53 and 100 minutes after immersion. Later examination of his laboratory notes by Leo Alexander, psychiatric advisor to the chief prosecutor for war crimes at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, revealed that death actually took longer, from 80 minutes to 5 to 6 hours. Wiley Online Library. That detail underscores something crucial. Even the surviving records are often fraudulent in their reported data. Dr. Robert Berger of Harvard Medical School published a comprehensive review in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1990. Concluding that the Dachau data were riddled with inconsistencies, methodological flaws, and outright falsification. Berlin Experiences. If Rascher's records, which survived and were presented as evidence at Nuremberg, are scientifically fraudulent, the question of what kind of data similar experiments in Auschwitz produced, where the archives were destroyed, gains an additional dimension. Not only is it unknown what happened, there is also no way of knowing whether what the doctors recorded reflected what they actually observed. The resistance experiments in Auschwitz also included studies on tuberculosis, malaria, and infectious diseases conducted by camp physicians on selected prisoners. Helmuth Vetter, a physician at Auschwitz and SS captain who also worked for Bayer/IG Farben, tested anesthetics on female prisoners and wrote to Höss requesting more subjects after the first group died during the trials. That correspondence between Vetter and Höss regarding the transfer of female prisoners for Bayer experiments is one of the most extraordinary documents that survived from the camp archives. But the specific outcomes of what happened to those women, how many died, which ones survived, and what clinical data Vetter collected are not documented in any known archive. Mystery 6. The experiments of forced artificial insemination. Among the least documented experiments at Auschwitz are those related to artificial insemination. Several testimonies from survivors and former female prisoners of the camp mention forced gynecological procedures that went beyond sterilization, forced insemination with the apparent aim of studying controlled reproduction methods. The scale of these procedures, the exact protocols used, and the data they sought to collect were never fully established by post-war tribunals. What is known with certainty is that Block 10 of Auschwitz I was reserved for gynecological experiments. Physician Karl Klauberg documented in a 1943 letter to Himmler that with his improved method he could sterilize hundreds of women per day. That letter was presented as evidence in the doctor's trial, but what is not fully documented is whether Klauberg's experiments included components of forced fertilization in addition to sterilization. The testimony of Gisela Perl, a Romanian Jewish gynecologist and prisoner of the women's camp, published in her 1948 book, includes descriptions of medical procedures performed on women in the camp that go beyond what official Nazi documents acknowledge. The exact technical details of artificial insemination experiments, if they were carried out systematically, remain without documentary confirmation. Mystery 7. The 16,000 missing objects from Crematorium 3. In the summer of 1967, in communist Poland, an archaeological team supervised by researchers from the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum excavated the ground adjacent to the ruins of Crematorium 3 in Birkenau. The crematorium had been blown up by the SS on January 20, 1945, just days before the arrival of the Red Army. The ground was a field of debris, broken concrete, twisted steel and disturbed soil. But beneath that deliberate destruction, the soil had preserved something the Nazis could not take with them. Archaeologist Andrzej Brzozowski filmed the excavation process in a short documentary titled Archaeology. The footage shows researchers extracting objects from the ground, fragments of shoes, deteriorated jewelry, watches, cutlery, thermometers, tobacco pipes, lighters, buttons, keys. Objects that in almost all cases represented the last things their owners had touched in life, left in the changing room of the gas chamber when they were ordered to undress before entering. The proximity of Crematorium 3 to the selection point and the route toward the gas chambers explains why the objects were there. During periods of peak activity in the camp in the summer of 1944, the process was so fast and the volume so high that many objects fell to the ground, were lost among the debris of the clearing of clothing, or were simply not collected before the next transport arrived. The ground itself became an accidental archive. The museum's collection records showed only just over 400 objects from these excavations. The researchers were convinced, however, that there had to be many more. They began a months-long investigation verifying archival documentation. The verified traces broke off. The people who had worked at the museum at the time were no longer there. The filmmaker had died, the institutions that created the film had changed, and the archives were silent. Director Piotr Siwinski offered the most convincing historical and political explanation for the disappearance. The 1967 excavations took place in the summer. The objects were classified and stored, presumably for analysis and cataloguing. Then came the Polish autumn of 1967, and with it the beginning of the anti-Semitic campaign of the Gomułka regime. There was a political shift in 1968, and the communist authorities took a clearly anti-Semitic course. Perhaps for this reason, they did not rush the implementation and closure of this project. These were difficult times for topics related to the Holocaust. The 48 cardboard boxes were sent to the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, where they remained for 4.5 decades, uncatalogued, unlabeled, and without any visible connection to Auschwitz. The transition from the communist regime to democracy in 1989 shook Polish institutions and redistributed archives and collections through multiple reorganizations. The boxes survived all of this because no one knew exactly what they contained. The investigation that finally recovered them began in 2015 when museum researchers saw Brzozowski's 1967 documentary for the first time and recognized the scale of what had been excavated. The localization process took months. After careful investigation, museum officials contacted the last living members of the original archaeological study who helped point to the Polish Academy of Sciences, where the objects had been stored. There, museum officials found the remaining missing artifacts still kept in 48 cardboard boxes. On June 3, 2016, the objects returned to the memorial. But the recovery of those 16,000 objects raises a broader question about how many informal or semi-formal archaeological excavations were carried out at Auschwitz during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, when the camp was an active archaeological site, but the Polish political context meant that institutions related to the Holocaust operated with limited resources and without guaranteed institutional continuity. How many of those materials ended up in other collections, in regional Polish archives, or were simply lost during post-communist reorganizations is impossible to determine. What can be stated is that the ground of Birkenau still contains areas that have not been systematically excavated. Ground-penetrating radar analyses conducted since the 1990s have identified subsurface anomalies in areas adjacent to Crematoria 2, 3, and 4, that could correspond to deposits of objects similar to those discovered in 1967. The museum works with the resources it has in a 175-hectare site, with the dual responsibility of preserving what is already known and protecting the integrity of the site as a place of burial. Mystery. 8. The operation of improvised gas chambers. In the first months of 1942, before crematoria 2, 3, 4 and 5 at Birkenau began operating, the Nazis needed a temporary solution. They found it in 2 abandoned farmhouses in the village of Brzezinka, which the prisoners called the Red House and the White House. The SS referred to them as Bunker 1 and Bunker 2. The Red House was a small brick building whose owners had been expelled. The Nazis bricked up its windows and converted its 4 rooms into 2 airtight chambers. The doors bore signs that read "Zur Desinfektion," for disinfection. It was operational by March 1942. The White House, larger in size, was ready in June 1942. The exact functioning of these improvised facilities is only partially documented. We know that Zyklon B was introduced through holes in the walls or ceilings. We know that the bodies were buried in mass graves nearby until 1943, when, with the arrival of the permanent crematoria, the graves were opened and the bodies exhumed and cremated. The Sonderkommando of that period was later murdered to silence the witnesses. What historians have not been able to fully establish are the specific technical parameters of these improvised facilities. How many people could each chamber contain? How long did the gassing process last, given the variable concentrations and temperatures of the Polish winter and summer? How many SS guards were needed for each operation, and how were they protected from the gas that could escape when the doors were opened? Bunker 1 was demolished in 1943 and Bunker 2 in November 1944. The original plans of these facilities have never been found. Mystery. 9. The ventilation design of crematoria 2 and 3. The act of writing in Auschwitz was a political act of the highest order. The camp was designed precisely to erase the possibility of testimony. No names, no recorded identities for most of the victims, no witnesses who could survive. The Sonderkommando was the weakest link in that chain of silence from the perspective of the SS, because its members saw the entire process. That is why they were regularly rotated, killed and replaced. That is why they lived isolated from the rest of the prisoners. But some of them wrote, and they buried what they wrote. The Auschwitz scrolls are a variety of documents written by members of the Sonderkommando. These writings were buried in the grounds of the crematoria in 1944. Between 1945 and 1980, 8 deposits of documents by 5 known authors were discovered, mostly by chance. Few of those who knew their locations had survived. The 5 known authors are Zalman Lowenthal, Zalman Gradowski, Leib Langfuss, and Marcel Najari. Their writings are in Yiddish, Polish, and Greek. The discoveries took place on different dates. The first manuscript by Gradowski was recovered on March 5, 1945, just weeks after liberation, because the Sonderkommando member Shlomo Dragan, who had survived the evacuation march, knew exactly where it was buried. Others were found in 1952, 1962, and 1980 during excavation work in the crematoria grounds. The manuscript of Marcel Najari, a Sephardic Jew from Thessaloniki, was discovered in 1980 buried in a metal thermos at a depth of 40 centimeters. It was so deteriorated by moisture that it took decades to become partially legible. One of the few things that gave the prisoners a sense of hope in their daily struggle was resistance work. Working in the gas chambers and crematoria, the Sonderkommando had witnessed a hidden genocide on an industrial scale. They used their position to obtain paper, bottles, and cans to write down what was happening and bury it in the ground around the crematoria and gas chambers. The members of the Sonderkommando wrote notes for their families, created records of their experiences, and documented the number of people killed in the gas chambers. Hundreds of these notes were discovered after liberation by the Red Army and the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. The transport list recovered among the manuscripts is especially significant. It records date, number of people, whether they were men, women, or children, place of origin, and the crematorium used. It uses the internal numbering of the Sonderkommando, different from the official numbering. It is the only written record from inside the extermination process in real time, not the reconstruction of a survivor, but the chronicle of someone who was present while it was happening. Zalman Gradowski, a prisoner of the Sonderkommando, wrote in notes unearthed after the war in the grounds of Crematorium 3, Recently they have begun to erase the traces, and wherever there were large quantities of ashes, they have ordered them to be finely ground, taken to the Vistula and released into the current. We have dug up many graves, but there are still 2 pits open in the grounds of the 2nd and 3rd crematoria. Several pits are still filled with ashes. A vast amount of ash from hundreds of thousands of Jews, Russians and Poles is scattered and ploughed into the grounds of the crematoria. Gradowski was born in Suwałki, Poland, around 1908 or 1910. The sources differ on the exact year. He settled with his wife Sonia in Luna, a small town near Grodno. He was a devout Jew who worked as a clerk and had a solid literary education. He was deported to Auschwitz from the Grodno ghetto in December 1942. His wife Sonia was murdered in the gas chambers on December 8, 1942, the day after Gradowski's arrival at the camp. He was assigned to the Sonderkommando on the same day his wife was being murdered. His 2 discovered manuscripts contain 4 accounts on different subjects and a brief letter. The first, a separate notebook, may have been written as early as 1943. The second, in 3 parts, begins with a metaphorical address to the moon and describes events that occurred between February 24th and March 8th, 1944, including the selection of members of the Sonderkommando who were deported from the camp on February 24th, and the extermination of nearly 4,000 Jews from the Theresienstadt ghetto on the night of March 8th to 9th, 1944. Gradowski also actively participated in the planning of the Sonderkommando uprising that took place on October 7, 1944. He died in that uprising or in the immediate reprisals that followed. The first manuscript by Gradowski was found shortly after the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, when the Soviet State Extraordinary Commission began its work collecting evidence of the crimes committed by the SS. One of the prisoners who helped from the very beginning was the Sonderkommando member Shlomo Dragon, who had escaped the evacuation march. Knowing exactly where Gradowski had buried his manuscript in the grounds of Crematorium 3, he personally recovered it from the ground on March 5, 1945. The whereabouts of the remaining undiscovered archives remain an open question that specialists at the museum study using geophysical methods. Ground-penetrating radar analyses applied to the area of the crematoria have detected subsurface anomalies consistent with buried objects, but most of these areas have not been excavated due to considerations of respect for human remains that could also be present in the same ground. The search, therefore, proceeds at a pace that reflects both technical limitations and the ethical dilemmas of intervening in what is simultaneously a historical archive and a burial site. Mystery X, the chess pieces buried under the floor of Block 8. Not all resistance in Auschwitz was armed. Not all of it was political. There existed a form of resistance that the Nazis could not see because it left no visible trace. Cultural resistance, the act of keeping humanity alive under conditions designed to destroy it. In Barrack No. 8 of Auschwitz I, archaeologists carrying out conservation work discovered beneath the wooden floor a set of chess pieces hand-carved from fragments of bone, metal and wood. Small, clandestine sculptures, imperfect and beautiful. Someone, an unidentified prisoner whose name is not recorded, took materials from the surroundings and patiently carved all 32 pieces of a chess set in order to play in secret. The discovery was published by Yahoo News in 2022 and formed part of a broader report on objects found beneath the camp floors during conservation work. The chess pieces were accompanied by other hidden items: buttons, fragments of letters, small coins, a comb, objects without apparent value, objects that had possibly cost their owners their lives to obtain. Who carved those pieces? How many prisoners played chess in secret in Barrack 8? For how long? Did the SS ever discover the game? The answers are buried in a silence that carbon and wood cannot break. Chess was the private language of someone who refused to stop thinking. Our Mystery 11, the secret archives of the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando of Auschwitz-Birkenau was the group of prisoners, mostly Jewish, whom the SS forced to operate the extermination facilities. They removed the bodies from the gas chambers, cut the hair from the dead, extracted gold dental prostheses, transported the bodies to the crematoria, and incinerated the remains. Members of the Sonderkommando lived separated from the rest of the camp, with access to better food rations and slightly improved living conditions. The price was becoming witnesses to an industrial genocide from which they could not escape. Their life expectancy was short. They were regularly killed and replaced to eliminate witnesses. In that context, some of them did something extraordinary, they wrote. They buried their testimonies in the ground near the crematoria so that one day, if a survivor could indicate the location, the world would know exactly what had happened from inside the extermination process. These writings were buried in the grounds of the crematoria in 1944. Between 1945 and 1980, 8 deposits of documents by 5 known authors were discovered, mostly by chance. Few of those who knew their locations had survived. The identified authors are individual voices with first and last names and places of origin. Leib Langfuss was a Dayan, a religious judge from Maków Mazowiecki, a small town north of Warsaw. He was deported to Auschwitz in December 1942. His text, The Deportation, written in Yiddish and filling nearly an entire notebook, recounts the story of the deportation of the Jews from the Maków ghetto. Zalman Lowenthal, from the town of Ciechano, northwest of Warsaw, was deported to Auschwitz at the end of 1942 and assigned to the Sonderkommando in January 1943. His manuscript is the most detailed. It includes the plans for the Sonderkommando uprising and the chronicle of how what actually happened on October 7, 1944, was very far from what they had planned. The manuscript was heavily damaged by water and the pages were separated and mixed during attempts to preserve them. The case of Zalman Gradowski is perhaps the most documented in terms of the process of burial and discovery. Born in Suwałki, Poland around 1908, Gradowski was a cultured man with literary talent. He was deported from the Grodno ghetto in December 1942 along with his entire family. His wife, Sonia Gradowski, was murdered in the gas chambers on December 8, 1942, the day after his arrival. Gradowski was assigned to the Sonderkommando, and in that hell he became a writer. He wrote in Yiddish in prose that his later translators and editors have described as poetic, even when it describes the indescribable. Gradowski placed the documents in an aluminum canteen and buried them in the ashes of the crematorium courtyard. However, he moved them again when the Nazis began removing the pile of ashes. Liberty University. He was aware that he needed to hide the evidence in several places to increase the chances that some of it would survive. The first manuscript by Gradowski was recovered on March 5, 1945, just weeks after liberation. The Sonderkommando member Shlomo Dragan, who had escaped the evacuation march to Wodzisław Śląski, knowing exactly where Gradowski had buried his manuscript in the grounds of Crematorium 3, personally recovered it from the ground. There is a fourth name, Marcel Nadjeri, a Greek Jew from Thessaloniki, deported to Auschwitz in the major transport of 50,000 Greek Jews in 1943. His letter was found in 1980 near Crematorium 3, in such an advanced state of deterioration that it took decades to partially decipher. In 2017, researchers at the University of Crete used multispectral imaging techniques to recover the text of a water-damaged manuscript that the human eye could not read. What they found was the writing of a man who knew he was going to die and who wanted his mother to know what had happened to him. The members of the Sonderkommando also buried teeth as physical evidence of the murder of the Jews, since their bodies were burned and their bones crushed. The workers who had to extract teeth likely hid some while working in order to bury them later. They also hid clothing, photographs, and other objects, but the teeth were a direct and important link to the murder. The known documents include exhaustive transport lists, date, number of victims, geographic origin, and crematorium used. They are the only internal source of data on the operation of the gas chambers written by direct witnesses in real time. One list records the date, how many people, whether they were men, women, or children, where they came from, and the crematorium in which they were murdered. The Sonderkommando used a numbering system different from the one used today by the Auschwitz Museum. The 8 deposits discovered between 1945 and 1980 represent a fraction of what may still be buried. Members of the Sonderkommando who could not indicate the location of their texts to Soviet soldiers because they died on the evacuation march of January 1945, or who survived but were not found in time by investigators, took that information to their graves. The search for the still undiscovered archives continues. The ground around crematoria 2, 3, and 5 of Birkenau, the areas where the Sonderkommando had access, continues to be the subject of non-invasive archaeological surveys. Each new subsurface imaging technique opens the possibility that one day the Earth will reveal a metal container, a sealed jar, a waterproof bag containing the last words of someone who witnessed what no human being should ever have had to witness. Mystery 12, Schindler's List and the Original Documents of Auschwitz. Oskar Schindler was a German industrialist from Moravia, a member of the Nazi Party, a well-known womanizer, and an opportunistic businessman. He arrived in Krakow in 1939, taking advantage of the German occupation to take over a factory expropriated from Jewish owners. His initial motivations were purely economic: cheap slave labor, lucrative military contracts. What happened between 1942 and 1945 transformed Schindler into a very different historical figure. Over that period, Schindler protected his Jewish workers from deportations to extermination camps, arguing that they were essential workers for war production. The list we are referring to, the famous Schindler's List, was compiled in October and November 1944, when Schindler negotiated the transfer of 1,200 workers from his factory in Krakow to a new facility in Brunlitz in Czechoslovakia in order to prevent them from being sent to Auschwitz during the liquidation of the ghettos and labor camps in the region. The documentary point of contact with Auschwitz is crucial. Part of those 1,200 workers, upon being evacuated from the labor camps in the Krakow region, were temporarily interned in Auschwitz. In particular, the 300 women included in the list were initially sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau instead of Brunlitz, as mentioned in the documentary material included in the reference. Schindler had to intervene personally to get them out of the camp. The documentary mystery is real. The original document of Schindler's List exists in multiple versions. The list was rewritten several times during the process of compilation and negotiation. The original document signed by Schindler that corresponded exactly to the 1,200 workers who passed through Auschwitz has never been found in the camp archives. The Auschwitz records from that period are fragmentary because the SS massively destroyed documentation in the days preceding the evacuation of the camp in January 1945. Mystery 13. The exact location of the camp archives. The SSS implemented a protocol for destroying evidence during the final weeks of the camp's existence. Heinrich Himmler had given explicit orders that no prisoner should fall alive into enemy hands, and that evidence of the crimes had to be eliminated. On January 18, 1945, the mass evacuation began. Approximately 58,000 prisoners were forced to march westward under armed guard. The SS dynamited crematoria 2 and 3 on January 20th and crematorium 5 on January 26th. The Canada storage complex was set on fire on January 23rd. It burned for 5 days, but they made a mistake. They burned the records of the main camp. They did not burn the construction archive, which was kept in a different building and which Soviet troops found intact when they liberated the camp on January 27th. That construction archive contains the plans of Birkenau that are today preserved at Yad Vashem. However, the destruction of prisoner records was massive. Of the 1.3 million people who passed through Auschwitz, only 400,207 were registered with serial numbers. The remaining 900,000 were sent directly to the gas chambers without being recorded, which means that no nominal documentation ever existed of their presence in the camp. The deportation records from some European countries, especially Hungary, survived and allow for a partial reconstruction of how many people were deported. But for many other groups, the numbers are estimates based on indirect evidence. What additional documents might still remain undiscovered? Institutions such as the International Center on Holocaust Studies and Jewish Resistance, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum continue to receive private documents donated by families or discovered in private collections decades after the end of the war. The scale of what was destroyed in January 1945 makes it impossible to determine exactly what was lost. Mystery 14. Why did the Allies not bomb the rail lines? On April 4, 1944, an Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Auschwitz area for the first time. The mission was to photograph the IG Farben industrial plant at Monowitz. The photographs also showed the adjacent camp, although they were not analyzed for that purpose at the time. By the end of May 1944, the Allies had detailed information about what was happening at Auschwitz. On April 27, 1944, Rudolf Verber, serial number 44070, and Alfred Wetzler, serial number 29162, escaped the camp and reached Slovakia with a detailed account of the extermination process. Their report, the so-called Verber-Wetzler report, reached the Slovak Jewish Council and was distributed to Allied governments. In the summer of 1944, between May and early July, 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz at a rate of up to 12,000 people per day. The process was visible from the air. On June 26th, 71 B-17 bombers on another mission had flown over or crossed 3 railway lines leading to Auschwitz. On July 7th, shortly after the US War Department rejected requests from Jewish leaders to bomb the rail lines leading to the camps, 452 bombers of the 15th Air Force flew along and across the 5 deportation rail lines on their way to bomb oil refineries at Blechhammer nearby. The Slovak rabbi Michael Dov Weissmandl was the first to specifically propose bombing the railways on May 16, 1944. The proposal was sent to the British government and the United States government. Historian Martin Gilbert and David Wyman have documented in detail the responses it received. In response to the bombing requests, Under-Secretary of War John J. McCloy stated that such an operation could only be executed by diverting considerable air support currently engaged in decisive operations elsewhere, and in any case would be of such doubtful effectiveness that it would not justify the use of our resources. The argument was false, according to the military records themselves. The IG Farben facilities at Auschwitz III were bombed 4 times between August and December 1944 by the US 15th Air Force based in Italy, on August 20th, September 13th, December 18th, and December 26th. On September 13th, 1944, bombs falling short of their industrial target accidentally hit SS barracks in Birkenau, killing 5 SS members. This demonstrated that Allied aircraft could reach the target. The Prime Minister Churchill had no doubt about the nature of the crime. As he wrote to Anthony Eden when he received reports of what was happening at Auschwitz, "There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world, and it has been carried out by scientific machinery, by men nominally civilized in the name of a great state." However, the bombings did not happen. Why? The debate among historians continues. The most documented explanation suggests a combination of factors: the military priorities of the Normandy campaign and the Eastern Front, the bureaucratic process for target approval, and, on some levels, a political indifference toward the specific fate of the Jewish population, which historian David Wyman described in his 1984 book as the abandonment of the Jews. The Allied bombing of Auschwitz-Birkenau in mid-July 1944 would not have saved the approximately 310,000 Hungarian Jews whom the Germans had murdered upon arrival at the extermination center between May 15th and July 11th, 1944. Holocaust Encyclopedia, but it could have saved hundreds of thousands more. Mystery 15. The inaction in response to the Auschwitz Protocols. The Auschwitz Protocols are one of the most extraordinary documentary sources in the entire history of the Holocaust. 4 accounts written by escaped prisoners that described with technical, geographical, and statistical precision the functioning of the extermination camp. They were completed and distributed between April and June 1944, precisely when the rate of extermination at Auschwitz reached its historical peak with the deportation of Hungarian Jews. The Verber-Wetzler report was written by Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wetzler after their escape on April 27, 1944. It included maps of the camp, estimates of the number of victims, descriptions of the selection and gassing process, and explicit warnings about the imminent deportation of Hungarian Jews. The Rosin-Mordowich report was prepared by Arnost Rosin, serial number 29858, and Czesław Mordowich, serial number 84216, who escaped on May 27, 1944. Together, these documents described Auschwitz with a level of precision that no Allied intelligence report had achieved until then. The protocols reached the Czechoslovak government in exile in June 1944. Information about Auschwitz reached new levels of detail after the escapes of 2 prisoners in April 1944 and 2 more a month later. Their combined testimonies formed the basis of the documents known as the Auschwitz Protocols. Churchill was pressured to bomb the rail lines or the gas chambers to stop the killings, but the arguments continued throughout the summer. Military commanders said that a precision attack had almost no chance of success. However, no thorough study of the matter was ever carried out. The historical mystery is not whether the Allies had the information, because they clearly did. The mystery is the exact sequence of bureaucratic and political decisions that led to that information, received in the spring of 1944, producing no military action until the gas chambers at Auschwitz were closed by order of Himmler on November 1st or 2nd, 1944. How many people died during those months while the documents circulated through government offices in London and Washington is a question that historical arithmetic can answer, but that no bureaucratic memorandum can justify. Mystery 16. The hidden gas chambers beneath the asphalt. When Soviet forces arrived at the camp on January 27, 1945, they found crematoria 2 and 3 blown up, crematorium 4 partially demolished, and crematorium 5 dynamited the day before. The SS had been deliberately meticulous. The walls of the underground gas chambers had been destroyed, the roofs had collapsed, and the rubble covered the landscape of Birkenau at the western end of the camp. Decades after liberation, systematic archaeological excavations have continued revealing the true outlines of those extermination facilities. Work carried out in the 1990s and continued in the 2000s and 2010s has identified foundation structures that did not fully appear in known plans. Buried walls that suggest the installations could have been slightly different in their final configuration than what is indicated in the 1941 plans preserved in Yad Vashem. In 2014, archaeologists working at the site of the Sobibor extermination camp in eastern Poland used ground-penetrating radar techniques to identify underground structures without excavating them. The same techniques have been applied in Auschwitz-Birkenau and have revealed anomalies under the ground in areas that were believed to be completely known. The exact location of all the gas chambers, including the improvised installations of the early years of the camp, is not completely documented on the surface of the current terrain. Part of those structures lies beneath the asphalt and the ground that today form the memorial site. Mystery 17. The real number of victims. More than 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. That figure, calculated by historian Franciszek Piper in his study from the late 1980s and published by Yad Vashem in 1991, is the strongest academic consensus that exists. But it is a minimum estimate. Piper explicitly acknowledged this in his methodology. He relied on train arrival schedules combined with deportation records that survived in the countries of origin. Those records have gaps. Deportees from the Soviet Union are insufficiently documented. The Roma and Sinti, deported from multiple countries without the same level of bureaucratic registration, are even less documented. Children underage who arrived with their families and were sent directly to the gas chambers without any registration process are, by definition, invisible in the archives. Earlier estimates were much higher. The Soviet communique of May 8, 1945, stated that 4 million people had been murdered at the site based on the capacity of the crematoria. Rudolf Höss testified before the Nuremberg prosecutors that at least 2.5 million people had been gassed, although in his memoirs written in prison he questioned that figure as excessive. The real mystery is not the round number. It is what lies behind it, the unknown names, the undocumented lives, entire families who arrived at Auschwitz in cattle cars and disappeared into the ashes without leaving a trace in any archive. Zalman Gradowski, a prisoner of the Sonderkommando, wrote in notes unearthed after the war in the grounds of Crematorium 3. Lately they have begun to erase the traces, and wherever there was a lot of ash they have ordered it to be ground finely, taken to the Vistula and released with the current. We have unearthed many graves, but there are still 2 pits open in the grounds of the 2nd and 3rd crematoria. Several pits are still filled with ash. A vast amount of ash from hundreds of thousands of Jews, Russians and Poles is scattered and ploughed into the grounds of the crematoria. Mystery 18. The exact destiny of the ashes. There is a question that visitors to Auschwitz-Birkenau rarely ask because its answer is unbearable. Where did the ashes go? It is known that they were used in multiple ways. Rudolf Höss, in his memoirs written while in custody, described an order from Heinrich Himmler transmitted in July 1942 through Adolf Eichmann's office and SS commander Paul Blobel. All mass graves were to be opened and the bodies incinerated. Furthermore, the ashes were to be disposed of in such a way that it would be impossible in the future to calculate the number of bodies incinerated. It is known that the ashes were scattered in the Vistula River. It is known that they were buried in pits in the Birkenau forest. It is known that they were used as fertilizer in the agricultural fields of the complex, as described in the testimony of the subcamp Wirtschaftshof Budi, where prisoners mixed human ashes with grass and manure. It is known that some of the bones that had not been fully cremated were ground in wooden mortars and scattered. What is not known is the exact location of all the ash pits in the Birkenau forest. Archaeological investigations of the site have identified some of those pits, but the work is not complete. In the Polish autumn, when vegetation dries out, soil analyses reveal anomalies that suggest the presence of organic materials at various depths. The museum's conservation team works systematically, but the Birkenau terrain covers 175 hectares and its full scientific exploration requires decades. For victims' families, locating those pits has a dimension that goes beyond archaeology. It is the only possible place of mourning for people who have no identified grave. The artificial ponds of Birkenau, where the Sonderkommando was forced to scatter ashes during the camp's period of highest activity, are today part of the memorial landscape, places where families place flowers without knowing whether the ashes of their loved ones are actually there. Mystery 19. The unexplored mass graves with uncremated remains. When the Birkenau crematoria could not keep up with the pace of killing, the bodies were buried in mass graves. In the early years of the camp, between 1942 and 1943, when the permanent crematoria were not yet operational or did not have sufficient capacity, the victims of the improvised gas chambers were buried in mass graves in the Birkenau forest. Himmler ordered in 1943 the exhumation and cremation of those bodies under Action 1005, the systematic program for destroying evidence of mass executions. Action 1005 was supervised in eastern Poland by SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel and was also applied in Auschwitz. The Sonderkommando were forced to dig up the mass graves, remove the bodies in an advanced state of decomposition, and burn them on open-air pyres. But the operation was not completed in all cases. The work was physically unbearable, even for prisoners threatened with death. The smell of the decomposing bodies was detectable several kilometers away. The testimonies of several members of the Sonderkommando described the scale of the horror of that exhumation. Researchers from the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum have identified, through ground-penetrating radar analysis and soil samples, areas in the Birkenau forest where there could be graves with uncremated remains that were not discovered during Action 1005. These areas are marked and protected by the museum as part of the burial ground, but they have not been fully excavated out of respect for the dead. Polish legislation on burial sites and the museum's position as a commemorative institution establish clear limits on archaeological excavation in these areas. What could be found in those graves if they were fully excavated would include documents, personal belongings, and possibly information that would allow individual victims to be identified. But the excavation of mass graves is also an intervention in a cemetery. The dilemma between the historical imperative and respect for the dead has no simple resolution. Mystery 20. The hidden objects in Block 17. The archaeology of fear leaves a specific kind of trace, hidden objects. Things prisoners buried under the floors of the barracks, sewed inside mattresses, concealed in double bottoms of everyday items. Not necessarily to retrieve them, but to preserve them from the systematic looting of the SS. In Block 17 of Auschwitz I, researchers carrying out conservation and documentation work found objects hidden under the floor: cutlery, small tools, fragments of documents, coins. Objects of no apparent value in the context of the camp that nevertheless represented something fundamental. Their owners' insistence on preserving something of their own in a system designed to strip prisoners of any possession and any identity. The specific mystery of Block 17 is twofold. First, the exact purpose of each object and the identity of its owners remain unknown. Cutlery was valuable in the camp because the difference between having a spoon and not having one was the difference between being able to eat and not being able to eat. Small tools could be used to make barter items. Fragments of documents could be letters, identifications, or passes that in certain circumstances could save a life. Second, the systematic excavation of the barrack area has not been completed. The Auschwitz Museum works with limited resources in a site that comprises hundreds of buildings and hectares of land. The basements of several blocks of Auschwitz are still partially unexplored from a formal archaeological point of view. What could be found in those spaces, what individual stories could emerge from objects still buried under the ground, is a mystery that time, humidity, and decomposition are progressively closing. The mystery that contains them all. Auschwitz is the unanswered question of modern history, not because the facts are uncertain, but because the facts are too certain. 1.1 million people murdered in a single place. 4 crematoria that incinerated bodies at a rate of 4,416 per day under normal conditions, and up to 20,000 per day using open-air pits in the summer of 1944. An industrial company, IG Farben, building a factory next to the camp to exploit the slave labor of prisoners condemned to death. A doctor with 2 doctorates, impeccably uniformed, selecting twins on the ramp while sending their families to the gas chambers. The mysteries described in this documentary are not anomalies of the system. They are the product of the same logic that built the camp. The deliberate destruction of evidence to make counting impossible, the systematic denial of individual identity to the victims to make mourning impossible, the scattering of ashes into the Vistula so that the river would erase what the archives had documented. After the war, only 789 members of the Auschwitz staff, no more than 15%, were tried. Commandant Rudolf Höss was hanged on April 16, 1947, next to Crematorium 1 of Auschwitz I, the same place where experiments with Zyklon B began in September 1941. Josef Mengele died free on a beach in Brazil in 1979 at 68 years old, with more than 3,000 pages of autobiographical notes that never included any remorse. The mysteries of Auschwitz are not only historical questions, they are evidence that the most documented crime in modern history is still incomplete in its reconstruction. There are still unexcavated graves, undiscovered archives, unregistered names, and testimonies yet to be uncovered. The work of historians, archaeologists, and forensic scientists at Auschwitz is not finished. It will not be finished in decades. Perhaps it will never be fully finished because the scale of what occurred exceeds any human capacity for complete documentation. And that is perhaps the deepest mystery of all, that a system industrially designed to erase any trace of its victims was so successful that 80 years later, with all the technology and methodology of the 21st century, we still cannot answer such fundamental questions as how many people died exactly, where their remains are, and what scientific records of their suffering remain hidden in some uncatalogued archive or in some forgotten cardboard box in an institutional basement. The ground of Birkenau is still speaking. The problem is that not everyone is listening.